to present our first speaker of the day, who's no other than Christian Mogensen, one of our NORDREF board members. He is a senior advisor on technological diplomacy to the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs based in Silicon Valley, and has a long background as an expert on the men populating the darker rabbit holes of the internet. He authored the report, The Angry Internet, an analysis of the extent of violent misogynists in the Nordics, and was one of the leading researchers in NORDREF's profiling of perpetrators of gender-based online abuse. Christian is here participating in this conference in the capacity of individual researcher and sector expert. Please give a warm welcome to Christian Mogensen.
Thank you, Tortis, and thank you, everybody else. I appreciate the declaration of trust as a white dude opening a conference about the plight of women online. It's not the first time it's happened. It's probably not going to be the last. I do want to live up to the trust that's bestowed upon me, and I'm going to do it from the inside out. I used to do this shit. I used to play video games. I used to play it competitively. I was a tier 4 diamond support main Nami Leona in League of Legends like 10, 12 years ago. I found out pretty quickly when I was playing competitive StarCraft in the early noughts. If I pissed off my opponent, they played worse and I could play better and I could win. I found out how to weaponize. Sometimes it was misogyny, sometimes it was toxic masculinity, and at some point I found out maybe this is kind of problematic. Sure, it was part of growing up. It was part of growing out of being an idiot, which you're kind of biologically destined to when you're a 15-year-old dude with the frontal lobes not fully connected. But there's also like an academic aspect to it, and I'm going to touch on that. When I'm done in 15, 16 minutes, I will hopefully have explained to you why misogyny works, how it works, and what we can do as men, as gender activists, as adults, as professionals, as men and boys, to combat it, because it is literally killing us, and as I have grown to understand, is pretty fucking annoying to the girls and women we subject to it. So, what I do want to state is a pretty obvious fact. When we talk about gender-based violence, when we talk about digital harassment, when we talk about dick pics, like Tortis just did, it's something that is predominantly done by men unto others. We talk about gender-based violence as sort of a neutral fact of the internet. It's not. It is a very conscious choice that is sometimes done. I'm going to explain why it is done, like what is the psychological hoops that are being jumped through in order to get to a place where we go, I bet she would love a dick pic, or I bet that I could weaponize this picture I have of my penis, or if I call her this, or if I say that strong men create weak men, and like so on and so forth, how we can theorize, how we can psychologically protect ourselves from the discrepancies of being a good man, but being evil or mean or bad unto others. One thing that we see when we dive into the rabbit holes of the misogynistic parts of the internet that I've researched way too much is often that the violence that is done is being portrayed as not only authorized because the women deserve it, either she was wearing a too short skirt, she had an opinion she was not supposed to have, or like she was a woman in a male-dominated field, like video games. We should put her in her place. It's not only authorized violence, it's necessary violence. We need to do this violence to uphold a sort of natural order of the world and of the internet. And it all ties back into an idea that I'll turn back to time and time again over my next 15 minutes. Times used to be better. Everything was better like 50 years ago. It was even better 100 years ago. 200 years ago, it was fucking awesome. Being a white man, sure. But I'm also going to be talking about how it actually has become a tiny bit more difficult being a white dude in 2024, 2023, and 2022 alike. It is a part of the perceived worldview of some of the guys doing this. Some of the guys thinking, I'm right to do this. I must do this. So what we're going to see when we get to the data aspects of this research field is that what is often weaponized is the differences between the perpetrators and the victims. if it's done unto women, well, you're not men, so I'm going to attack your womanhood or your womanness. If you're not white, well, then the problem is your skin color. If you're also a white dude, well, you're not dude enough. You're not manly enough. You're a weak man. As soon as I started working in this field, one of the things I found out was that I was not a real man. Not in sort of a Pinocchio kind of way, but in a masculinity kind of way. As soon as I started giving talks on, guys, maybe dick pics are kind of problematic, maybe we shouldn't do online gender-based violence, maybe we shouldn't do digital harassment, I had dudes in my inbox telling me I was not man enough, that I was a gender betrayer. My favorite is someone who said that I was not a man because I shaved in a wrong way. I haven't found the right way to shave still, but it's always the difference from the in-group to the victim. And there's this perceived notion of the strong men, and I use that in like the biggest quotation marks I can possibly do, the strong men against the different teams. The women, the colored people, everybody else. It's us against them. Therefore, the violence is necessary. I used to play video games. I still do, but I used to too. And I got my first own computer in 1989, and I started playing video games. I grew up with Guybrush Threepwood and Link, and as well as literary classics like the brothers Lionheart. In my mind, in my upbringing, they were exactly the same. And I spent years trying to tell everybody else, like the literary and cultural qualities that were in these games, in these universes, were equal to, or in some instances, even better than the books that was being read to me. I was a gamer through and through. So when I started university, I studied philosophy and psychology. I immediately went into, well, how can we find the philosophy and psychology of video games? So I studied the motivation for playing video games. Why do people actively seek out dragons to fight, princesses to save? Also a feminist issue, but why do we seek out other problems to solve online the more we find problems in our everyday life? And my first real job after university was to explain this motivation to parents and to professionals, to talk about the qualities of video games and video game communities, and say, like, what is the human aspect of a video game? And at some point, this turned me onto feminism. I was doing a podcast with a Danish video game researcher, Sarah Tabu, who after the podcast in which I had talked about it's a problem that not more women play video games because guys would like to play more video games with women. Women are missing out on some of the amazing adventures of Dark Souls or Super Meat Boy or like all of the other stuff that was amazing and was like expanding my view of the world. I had a seminal experience the first time I played Journey. And all of the other gamer guys I met at that point, I was like, did you play Journey? And they were like, yes. And I met girls and women in Friday bars and at family events and like out in the world. And I said, did you play Journey? And none of them said yes. And I was like, this is a problem. You're missing out. And I brought up some of these points in a podcast. And I also said that, well, if we don't have women in the video game community is going to skew towards the male fantasy. And it's not going to be a representation of the world that I love and want to engage with. And Sarah Tabu, the video game researcher, looked at me after the podcast and said, dude, you're a feminist. And I was like, no. I had an opposition to it because I was brought up thinking that feminists were a very, very certain type that hated men. So I was like, no, I'm not. I eat meat, and I'm like, I'm a dude. I'm a manly man. I'm not a feminist. But she was like, yeah, I'm pretty sure you're a feminist. And the more I started looking into it, the more I came to the realization, fuck, I'm probably a feminist. Do I need to change anything? And she was like, no, you're good. Like, you're talking about a democratic and equal world. That's kind of what it is. And I was like, fuck, okay, maybe I should look more into this. So I started using gaming as a tool to engage with young men. Because if you reach out to a bunch of 15, 16-year-olds and say, I want to talk about feminism, you're not going to have a good time. But if you say, I want to talk about video games, well, we found out at my old job, Center for Digital Youth Care, Center for Digital Pædagogik in Denmark, that we could at least engage the boys in video games. And as soon as we had them engaged, well, we could talk about basically anything because I was allowed to be cool. I was a role model. I was a Nami and Leona main when we played League of Legends. We had a connection. And that sort of opened the world to talk about basically everything else. I became, from a gamer, a reluctant feminist to now I'm pretty much just a very loud one. And I did a ton of work. Tordis mentioned some of it. I'm not going to dive into details with it. I've done interviews, I've done conversations, I've done data analysis on the iffy parts of the internet. But when we talk about feminism and gender equality and talk about philosophy, which is my academic upbringing, most people expect us to start by talking about Mary Wollstonecraft, who was like the mother of first wave feminism, also the mother of Mary Shelley, one of the best authors ever. Mary was also called a hyena in a petticoat from a rival academic when she was alive, which is a pretty badass nickname. But I would be a bad male philosopher if I didn't go even further back and said, this is all about Plato. So I'm going to start with Plato, which is often also what's done in like the dark corners of the internet when we want to explain why women should stay in the kitchen or in the bedroom. Because Plato wrote the Republic, which is basically like the recipe on how to build a successful society 375 years before Jesus Christ came alive and got crucified. In this book, Book 5 of the Republic, he talks about in order to have a solid foundation for society, we need to have philosopher kings that decide how do we govern the society. We need to have soldiers to protect the society, and we need to have producers to bring food into the society. And most bro dudes, manly men, read the Cliff Notes of the Republic. And in this sounds like a male fantasy. Because if we have philosopher kings, soldiers, and producers, that's my team, that's the dudes. Then we also have the women who are reduced to servants, victims, and receivers. Like we're back to the fucking awesome time we had 200 years ago where the dudes did everything and the girls made food and gave birth, which is very complacent psychological situation for men to be in. But Plato was kind of feminist and kind of socialist as well. Because if we actually read, well, he doesn't really problematize the fact that we also need slaves to get the society rolling, but it was a different time. Plato also wrote, well, actually, in order to have this society and for it to work, we need philosopher kings and philosopher queens, and they are supposed to be equal. And in order to make them equal, we must do away with the classical family structure. We must do away with the marriage, and we must do away with private property. Now, all of a sudden, Plato became a feminist icon, barring the notion about the slaves. Well, but we have had the recipe for a good gender equal society for 2,000 plus years. It doesn't really feel gender equal if we jump into the commentary fields on Facebook or the notions on TikTok or the dick pics on Snapchat. Why not? We have had the recipe for a very long time. So what we've seen is that the Republic, Plato's seminal work, was a utopia. The best of all worlds will end in this Republic. Real life is far from a utopia. So we have had a couple of thousand years where it was kind of practical to be a dude with wide shoulders who could fight, who could lift shit, who could build a cave. Luckily, or rather, like back when it was needed for you to have strong shoulders and build a cave, or I don't know, fight a saber-toothed tiger, or the Swedes if you're a Dane, you had an inherent value if you were a man. It was just more practical to be a man in this time and age. So men had an inherent value. If you were a man, you knew what you were supposed to be. You knew what gave you value, and you had an identity into society. You were good because you were a man. Times changed, and so did societies. And when we, as Danes, stopped fighting the Swedes, as we stopped hunting saber-toothed tigers and mammoths, as we stopped living in caves and bought the neighbor's house because we grew out of our own, we went from fighters, hunters, and shelterers to thinkers, deciders, and traders. But we still had a cultural history that, well, the guys are doing shit and the women are making food and giving birth. So this notion that was probably birthed out of necessity 2,000 years ago became a bad habit. And this bad habit was ingrained into society, and we've had it ever since. Like, Well, who's going to decide? Well, he's a white dude with rolled up sleeves. I guess he's the captain. I get the irony because that's what I'm rocking today. But this idea has permeated popular culture for the last 30, 40 years. Joe Rogan, and I used to like Joe Rogan. I thought he was a funny dude. Now I know he's just like a stupid dude that sometimes says funny shit. He loves this fantasy, this fallacy of strong men create easy times create weak men create hard times, which is a very palpable way of framing modern society because it gives us both the easy times. This is where we want to be, so it gives us a goal. It gives us an enemy. Who have destroyed the easy times? Well, the weak men, the liberal men, the feminist men, the vegan men, the men who drink milk with their coffee. It also creates an identity. Who are we? We are the strong men. We must be the strong, manly men that eat elk meat and hunt with a bow and, can fight. And it also gives us a situation, a problem to solve. We need to solve the hard times that have been created by the weak men so we can get over to the easy times. All of world history has been rewritten into 4 easy 2-word points. Nothing as complex as the real world can be reduced to such a degree. But it sounds cool, like it's a talking point. Strong men, easy times, weak men, hard times. Like it's a chorus to a song that we don't want to listen to anymore. But it's really, really catchy. And it paints a very easy and palpable picture of us and them. It gives us as strong men, that's who we want to be, an easily identifiable identity. At some point in world history, a person said, maybe women are people too, and then we burnt them at the stake. But this created one of the first identity problems for men. Because if women insisted on being people, and not just birth givers and food makers, well, then maybe men cannot also just be philosopher kings, soldiers, and producers. If women insist on an identity, then men have to create one as well. And that is not psychologically easy. If you are a human, then I have to be a human as well. And that means I need to reinvent this identity that has been given to me through society for the past 2,500 years. It doesn't mean that we or they don't want to do it. It's just harder to stomach psychologically. And we can paint I pulled this one out of the ass, this is not fact, but we have, since the suffragette movement or Mary Wollstonecraft, sort of moved in the direction of gender equality. We're not there yet, and Roe v. Wade was revoked and all of that. But generally, over the past 200 years, it's been a positive overall linear direction. And ever since this has started happening, men have been like, well, what about me? If she gets the right to vote, what if she's going to vote for something else than I want to vote at? I don't get to have my way if she gets to have her way. No, that's kind of how democracy works. Democracy is not cool if you're the minority, said the men who had been the majority for 2,500 years. But as soon as women started giving rights, men were like, maybe we should fight about it. And sure, we do it today. Andrew Tate, who shames feminists and refutes feminism in 2-minute TikToks. This is not a new thing. It's not new that women said, we have rights, and dudes were like, nah. This is an image from the Police Gazette in 1892, I think, and the picture is named, "The Mob Objects to a Lady Cyclist Wearing Socks." How dare she? Because socks gives the idea of an ankle, and ankles are sexy. And if she's sexy, I have to have sex with her. And if she's not, became kind of problematic. And we can go 500 years more back. Women started being like, we can do doctor shit. And dudes were like, nah, you're a witch. This is not a new thing. It all hinges on the idea of rights and privileges in society being a zero-sum game. The more she gets, the more I have to give. And I don't want to give, as if the right to vote is well, we have a certain number of votes and you get mine and you can have his, so on and so forth. The reluctance to gender equality is not a new thing. This is not a new problem we're trying to solve, which is probably why feminists have a reputation of being pissed off. I've heard so many feminists rightfully say, we've been doing this shit for decades, centuries, if not millennia. I'm new, I've been in the game for 5 minutes, but I'm starting to see the problem. This is not a new thing. But when we talk about this not only authorized, but necessary violence, we can put it into different aspects. All of the misogyny or gender-based violence groupings or the manosphere comes from the same misunderstood psychological math. The natural state was good. The natural state was not equal. Man was king, woman was subject. The natural state, therefore, is not feminist. Therefore, equality and feminism are not good, and we need to fight it. And this flavor of manosphere can be put into different aspects. It can be focused on sexuality, it can be focused on politics, it can be focused on masculinity. We can call them incels, pickup artists, hyper-conservatives, trolls, ethno-nationalists, alpha coaches, all sorts of stuff. But they all have digital aspects. We're in 2024. They are all reactive. They are all reacting to a woman vice president. They are all reacting to stuff that is happening, which is good. This is a hornet's nest we, you, all of us should be proud to be kicking. And speaking on the psychology of stuff, the last point is one of the safest things in this. All of these movements disregard the individual, me, for a greater goal. All of them also create a recipe for the good man. He needs to be strong, he needs to be wealthy, he needs to be attractive, he needs to be socially dominant, and he needs to be well educated, especially the socially dominant part. There is a misconflection of if he's loud, he's probably right. As soon as I say that, most women are like, oh yeah, I know that dude. It also creates, speaking on the plight of men, unnecessary, if you don't live up to this, you must be a loser. Jordan Peterson loves to diagnose loser men. If you don't do my 12 rules of life, you are a pathological male loser. This becomes a threat that we hang over the head of each other and say, if you don't conform to this recipe for a good man, you are a loser. And if you are a loser, you won't have any power in society, no women will like you, all of this. This has created opportunities for dozens of grifters. It can be the Andrew Tates, it can be the Joe Rogans, it can be the Donald Trumps. We're faced with a modern masculinity where instead of seeking therapy, we seek out enemies because those we can fight. We can't fight capitalism, but we can probably fight women. And if we attribute omnipotent powers to women, well, then we have an excuse when we are losing. There's no pressure in being a man if we reduce man to being a reactive force. Are men evil? No, some of them are assholes. But men are not inherently evil. But there has been a giant vacuum for alpha coaches or manly men who will teach other people to be manly men if they just pay them a fuck ton of money. I'm also going to share my notes, so I'm just going to do death by PowerPoint and read all of this to you. But I do want to say, misogyny is not an immovable fact. We can fight misogyny. We are fighting misogyny. This is what we're doing, and we're doing very well. One thing to leave you with is don't look for conversion of these men, look for a connection. I've been a fighter for 15 years. I box, I Thai box, I do MMA and jiu-jitsu. This used to be like a machismo masculinity party. Over the past couple of years, UFC fighters, world champions, Paddy Pimblett, Nicholas Dalby have started to talk about feminism, have started to talk about men need to go into therapy because we are quite literally dying from toxic masculinity. And if the self-proclaimed and globally acknowledged sexy motherfucker Prince can be a male icon, dress in leopard clothing and feather boas, and sing songs about emotions, and still be a pretty manly man, he could do it 30 years ago, you can do it today. So misogyny is not a fact. Prince is awesome, and don't look for conversion, look for a connection. Men are suffering from toxic masculinity too. Thank you.